Rohit from Kingston, who's going to speak for about 15 minutes, and then Carolyn will speak afterwards. Rohit, are you ready there?
Yeah.
Great, comrade. It's all yours.
Thank you, everyone, for joining today. Thank you, Sid. I would like to begin by, once again highlighting that this is an absolutely historic period that we are living through. The movement that began in the US after the murder of George Floyd continues to take North America and the entire world by storm, and has since become one of the biggest mass movements in history. What seemed to be difficult demands until the recent past, right, like the abolition of the policing system, now feel realistic and feels achievable. This is the power of the movement, and this is the power of the Black activists and workers who are leading this movement. And I'd also, before I begin, kind of give a shout out to our comrades from Marks 21 who are here today, who have been a part of the struggle in the US on the grounds. And here in Canada too, the struggle of the Wet'suwet'en land defenders and the Solidarity rail blockades and the ongoing fight by the Six Nations land defenders at 1492 Land Back Lane have all radicalized, and they continue to radicalize an entire generation of young activists and Indigenous land defenders who were born after the siege of Kansatake, or the so-called Oka conflict in the 90s. And also within the ranks of labor, we see that the rank and file pressure from below on the organizational leaderships of unions to lead the fight for racial justice is growing. It is uncompromising, and it is pushing labor organizations further to the left constantly. Yesterday, I read that in many chain stores in the US, like Whole Foods, retail workers are fighting back against their employer's decision to ban the wearing of Black Lives Matter masks and t-shirts to the workplace. Workers are saying not an inch back, and unions have thrown their full weight behind them. The time for compromise and the time for employer intimidation is over. We are also seeing that outside the working class, there is a real class anger towards the system that is finding its voice through direct and spontaneous actions on the streets. And we have seen that statues of slave traders and colonialists have been toppled down, and many more will continue to fall. Here at Queen's University, the law building, which is currently named after Sir John A. Macdonald, the monumental racist, is about to be denamed. And this is after Indigenous students on campus led a campaign with huge support. And this victory is happening in a university known for its upper class white enrollment and conservative liberal composition of the law faculty. And this really does speak volumes about the power and the spirit of our times. What makes this moment historic is also, it feels as though we are entering a new age of working class politics in North America altogether, where the fight against systemic racism and anti-Black racism in particular has become a necessary and uncompromising precondition for any kind of class politics. The question of race within class can no longer be ignored by leftists of any kind as merely, let's say, identity politics or anything, if they wish to be taken seriously by anyone. It is no longer possible to ignore the interests of Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities and be taken seriously as a working class organization at the same time. And this is an incredibly timely and important development, because racialized workers, especially in the unorganized workplaces, not only are the most precarious and exploited, but are also the ones whose labor holds significant power within the system if we look at the sectors within which racialized workers are disproportionately employed. The COVID-19 pandemic has revealed to us that especially without racialized workers in the grocery stores and other retail places, without the delivery workers, without the farm workers, without the transport workers and so on, the economy would crumble entirely from production to circulation to sales altogether. The most terribly ill-paid, precarious and exploitative jobs, which are all disproportionately done by Black, Brown, Indigenous and workers of color, are also the jobs without which the system cannot function at all. This is an important contradiction within our society that we must fully understand. The most powerless workers within the economy are also the ones who are the most vital for the economy to be able to function. And outside the economy as well, like the structural capacity of racialized workers and racialized people to significantly disrupt business as normal also rings true for Indigenous land defenders. When Indigenous people assert their rights over their territory and withhold their consent from economic activities on their lands, the economy is completely paralyzed. We saw how the rail blockade by the Tyendinaga Mohawks disrupted sea and rail, bled the economy profusely, and brought the federal government back to the table. And in addition to this, in addition to the structural power, there's also another important contradiction that we must remember. Not only are racialized workers the ones who hold significant power within the system by the nature of their labor, we're also the ones who are the most likely to be radicalized against the workings of this system by the virtue of our social position. What this means is that the experience of racial oppression, everything from the comments by your racist boss to systemic racism in society, pile upon the experience of poverty, pile upon the experience of class exploitation and precarity in a manner that racialized workers are often the ones who are the most desperate for a radical revolutionary change in society, and also the ones who would benefit the most from such a change, and also the ones who are least likely to compromise because of the history of accumulated violence the communities have faced. So when we are talking about Black, Indigenous, and racialized people, we are talking about the people who not only have the multiple reasons and the urgency to change society as we know it, but also the capacity to make that change possible. And this is true across the world, whether we are talking about Dalit Bahujan workers in India or Black and brown workers in the US and in Canada. And we are seeing a live demonstration of this incredible revolutionary capacity today in the US. And that's why when sections within the working class buys into the ideology of racism and separates itself out from the oppressed workers, thinking that their interests lie in a shared consensus with the ruling classes, they weaken themselves more than they weaken racialized workers. And we have evidence of this throughout history. Labor historians have shown that the overall conditions of white workers in the 1940s and 50s were much, much worse under exclusive white unions such as American Federation of Labor, whereas interracial unions such as Congress of Industrial Organizations were able to reduce the overall unemployment rates for both white and Black workers and win better wages for all. So it is important to recognize also proudly the significance of the multi-racial nature of the Black Lives Matter movement and the indigenous solidarity actions that are carried out in support of the land defenders here. The revolutionary capacity of workers, racialized workers, whether for labor actions, for social movements, or direct actions such as rail blockades, when amplified and protected by other sections of the working class, it makes the ruling class literally shit their pants. And we are seeing that today. As I was saying earlier, what makes our current moment historic is also that it feels as though we are entering a new age of working class politics in North America, where anti-racist organizing has become fundamental to our programs, and to be able to understand the power that racialized workers hold in the economy and its importance for class politics, and to be able to build an organization that is able to express that power and amplify it through a united front. We must first of all have the correct analysis of the relationship between capitalism and racism in the first place. As Alex Kalinikos says, that the idea that racism is wrong and is something that needs to be eradicated from society is something that many, if not most people living in the world today would wholeheartedly agree. But because most people do not understand the roots of racism, the solutions that are offered by most people tend to be insufficient or tokenistic. Things such as diversity and inclusion are important, but they are in no ways solutions, even in the short term or the long run. They might treat the symptom of the disease, but not the cause itself. And we understand this because we know that the system of capitalism has always been infused with racism from the very beginning. Racism is written into the very bones of the capitalist system from its very foundations. And this is something that Faleen pointed out in the previous session. It is not merely the case that capitalist exploitation breeds racism by producing and extending inequalities, which is of course true. Like, we know that capitalist system produces racism in various forms, institutionally, structurally, ideologically. We also know that it weakens the working class. It weakens the collective power of the working class by dividing us along racial and ethnic lines and by pitting us against each other. We also know that the divisions within the working class make it possible for the employers to attack workers altogether, to drive down wages, both by employing racialized workers at lower wages and by taking advantage of their precarity, but also by fermenting discontent among white workers by pointing towards racialized workers as migrants, racialized workers and migrants as the reason for their lack of dignified employment. While all of this is true, the relationship between racism and capitalism is also much deeper and more intimate than that. Racism is not only a function of capitalism such that it produces individuals who are racist, but conversely, the very system of capitalism was founded upon and continues to exist through racist violence in the first place. And this is from the colonial dispossession of the indigenous people to slavery of black people. Historically, the forced dispossession of indigenous people, the violent encroachment of European settlers into their lands, the grotesque brutality that it was carried out with, could be justified by the settlers only through the invocation of a difference between them and the other, a racial difference, and by extension through the development of white supremacy and white superiority. Racial difference was created so that private ownership and accumulation of land and property through violence, through rape, through subjugation could be carried out, which then became the foundational basis for capitalism. And this is a process which Marx calls primitive accumulation. This propensity of white European settlers to use racial difference as a justification for violence, as a justification for dehumanization and accumulation of wealth through this dehumanization concretized the very basis of this economic system that we are today a part of, and it was concretized during the period of plantation economy and the period of slave trade, and it continues till date to be one of the structuring principles of capitalism. The fact that migrant farm workers in Canada, many of them black immigrants, are forced to live in subhuman living conditions under temporary resident statuses without even basic necessities or living wages is a legacy that directly follows from the racist foundations of the system. This history of capitalism is something that black revolutionaries like Angela Davis and others have taught us. And this is also something that Marx himself explicitly identifies in his writings on the American Civil War and in his letters in that period, where he says that direct slavery is as much the pivot upon which our present day industrialism turns as our machinery, credit, etc. Without slavery, there would be no cotton. Without cotton, there would be no modern industry. It is slavery which has given value to the colonies. It is the colonies which have created world trade, and world trade is the necessary condition for large-scale machine industry. Therefore, slavery is the economic category of paramount importance. And when we understand racism as a foundational ground of the capitalist system, it also becomes clear why workers who face simultaneously both racial oppression and capitalist exploitation, especially women, must be at the heart of the anti-capitalist struggle as leaders, as organizers, as thinkers, as revolutionaries. And this is not only a question of leadership or morality, but the very possibility of a revolutionary change in society literally depends on it. If we are to take the principle of Marxism that the emancipation of the working class can be done only by the class itself, then it is absolutely necessary that the working class organization reflects not only the concrete composition of the class in the sectors which are most crucial to the economy, but also is led by the most radical and the most developed consciousness within the class. And today there is no doubt that this means that the movement must be led by black, brown, and indigenous workers. And this is not a prescription from the outside, or it is a description of what is already happening. We are witnessing this right now. And this is what makes this movement so historic and so powerful. And before I end, I also want to talk about about the system of policing and how to understand it within the context of the racial roots of capitalism. If racial difference and if racism was the ideology that makes primitive wealth accumulation and property ownership possible, and we know this is the case, and we know this is the foundation upon which capitalism is founded. The system of policing was the means to then protect and maintain. The system of policing was the means to protect and maintain the wealth and the property so accumulated and locked away from the hands of the dispossessed. It was designed to preserve a system established through violence with more violence. The whole system of policing was put in place to protect stolen property rather than to prevent theft. And this must be remembered over and over and over again. And history speaks for itself. Soon after the abolition of slavery, it was the slave patrols that were transformed into the sheriff's departments, which then became the muscle of the ruling classes, commissioned to enforcing segregation, to disenfranchising freed slaves, and to break any form of working class unity along racial lines that could threaten the existing property relations. And it continues to have the exact same social function today. And this is why policing is a racist system at its core. It is a tool of the ruling class to protect the stolen wealth. And therefore, it is not only anti-indigenous and anti-black, but also anti-labor in its social function. This is something for all sections of the working class to realize. And it is a conversation that we must have over and over again as a part of the Defund Dismantle Police campaign. We must ask our fellow workers, when you're fighting for a fair contract and when you're holding a picket line and the cops turn up, which side are they on? Why? Because police doesn't protect people, they protect property, and they don't protect you from wage theft, they protect your employer who stole your wages. The system of policing is anti-poor, as it is anti-working class, and it is racist to its rotten core. And as importantly, we need to kick the cops out of our unions. That is non-negotiable. We need to have these conversations over and over again in our workplaces, in our unions, in our neighborhoods, and bring more and more people into the fold in this fight for abolition of policing. Because this is 100% a labor issue from the beginning for at least two reasons. On the one hand, it is a demand that strengthens our class position within the system by disarming the ruling class. The weakening of the state makes it possible for us to build more confidence in the fight against the system by diminishing the coercive power of the state and simultaneously increasing the possibility for working class militants. And on the other hand, and as importantly, it is also a demand that means a lot to the everyday lives of the working poor, who lose themselves and their loved ones to this racist predatory system that is designed to keep them poor. 90% of all criminal defenders in the United States today plead guilty without a trial because they cannot afford a lawyer. More than half of the people incarcerated in county and city jails have not been convicted of any crime. They are there because they cannot afford bail. And of course, these are all disproportionately black and brown people. And that's why we say, as socialists, defund, disarm, and dismantle the racist police. And just to wrap up, finally, the most important lesson to learn from the history of capitalism from the Marxist perspective is that racism is not merely a byproduct of capitalism, such that we could make it less racist if we tried, or such that if we have black or brown president or a CEO, we would be able to fight racism effectively or end racism. But we learned that racism is branded into the very foundation of capitalism from the very beginning. It makes capitalism possible. It is one of the preconditions for private ownership of property itself. And therefore, to smash racism would require that capitalism itself be smashed altogether. And this is the job of the working class itself. In the latest article written by Sid in Socialist.Ca, he quotes Tony Cliff, who said that our policy of fighting racism, fighting fascism was two-track, attacking the rats and attacking the sewers in which the rats multiply. Fighting the fascists is not enough. One also has to fight unemployment, low wages, and social deprivation that creates the condition for the growth of fascism. This is of paramount importance to in the fight to smash racism. It is not enough to attack the rats, the far-right racists, but it is crucial to attack the sewers and changing the plumbing system altogether. And that is to be done by any means necessary. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you very much, Rohit. I have a couple of people who put up their hands. Just to let you know what we're going to do with the format is we're going to have Carolyn speak next, and then we will have time for discussion, and then everyone will be able to make their comments and or ask their questions then. But at this point, we're going to go ahead with Carolyn. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. When the Wet'suwet'en people made their stand against the pipeline being built across their traditional territories, it marked an historic moment in this country's colonial relations with the First Nations, and I'm going to come back to that. In the 1600s, the British and French empires were attempting to broaden their spheres of influence in North America. They fought imperialist wars against each other, all in the interest of increased profits and global hegemony. Imperialism, colonialism lays at the very heart of the Canadian state. A racist ideology accompanied it every step of the way, dehumanizing Indigenous peoples and seeing them as less. The intent was to transfer their land and resources into capitalist property to accumulate wealth for the ruling classes. Seeing Indigenous people as not as rational, not as developed as Europeans was part of the conquest and was quite explicitly racist. There have been many revolts against attempts to conquer Indigenous peoples, to take away their language and culture, sever their deep connection to the land and water. The Riel Rebellion of the Métis people, the Oka Fight Back, as it was called at Kanesatake, Muskrat Falls, Attawapiskat, most recently the Haudenosaunee land defenders in Caledonia, the Micmac lobster fishers, and the Justice for Joyce campaign. The residential schools, the missing and murdered Indigenous women are all brutal indicators of this legacy of the oppressions of the First Nations and exploitation of their lands and peoples. This viewpoint was maintained in ongoing Canadian foreign policy. If anyone's seen the recent book put out by Tyler Shipley, he gives many examples of this, both at home and overseas. One is, in the 1930s, there was an Indigenous uprising in Honduras against the Montreal-based company International Power. It was an electrical company which was sending electricity at extremely highly inflated rates to the local population. The Canadian government sent 2 armed naval vessels to help a brutal dictatorship put down the rebellion. It kept the repressive government in power, protecting Canadian economic interests. As Prime Minister Bennett said at the time, we had to act. We had no choice but to act against the communist Indians. This continues today at home and abroad. You can look at Canadian corporations overseas. Capitalism and racism, as Rohit said, go hand in hand. The fight for Indigenous sovereignty is centuries old and has not stopped. Idle No More rocked the nation when 4 women, white and Indigenous in Saskatchewan, put out the call for people to come together and build a unified struggle to push back against the ongoing and systemic racism that First Nations were facing in every province and territory. It had a strong resonance, not only within the Indigenous community, but in the broader progressive population as well. Many took to the streets, round dances were blocking intersections, International Women's Days across the country highlighted the struggles. This rising, along with the Occupy movement, brought activists into the streets, calling into question the profound racism that Indigenous people were facing and the capitalist system under which we all live, targeting the 1% which profits from the oppression and exploitation. This had a radicalizing effect on so many. Local struggles like Grassy Narrows in Northern Ontario gained support for their decades-long fight against the mercury poisoning of their waters by industrial pollutants, which was killing their people. The Wet'suwet'en Nation in the interior of British Columbia struck a critical step forward. As I mentioned earlier, the hereditary chiefs, as was said in an earlier section, put out a call for solidarity across the country as their people set up camps to block the pipeline. They were attacked by the RCMP, but support grew across Turtle Island. The Mohawks of Tenayanaga blocked the rails. Train transport was shut down across the country. The economic effect was incredible. Other blockades followed, but one of the first acts of solidarity was when the International Union of Longshore and Warehouse Workers walked up to a solidarity picket at the Delta Port in Vancouver and then said they would shut it down for a day to support the Wet'suwet'en struggle. This led to trade unions across the country coming out in support of their rights to self-determination. Members of OPSU, the provincial government employees here in Ontario, chartered a bus to support the Mohawks at Tyendinaga, standing shoulder to shoulder with Indigenous peoples. They are calling for the right to govern their own territories and resources and treat them as separate nations. This must be respected and fought for all of us. Trudeau, in his recent throne speech, spoke about how the government of Canada and Indigenous people should walk together the path of reconciliation. But these are empty words when it is financing a pipeline through Indigenous lands. They're acting on behalf of the class interests of the petroleum companies who are only concerned about maximizing their profit. Our government should not be bailing out the perpetrators, the corporations that caused the crisis, bailing out the fossil fuel companies, allowing expansion of the tar sands, clear-cutting pristine forests, driving pipelines through the heart of Indigenous communities. These same companies that exploit their own workers every day. There's a continued drive for profit going on, and Indigenous peoples and their lands are feeling it sharply. And we must recognize that it is they who are leading the struggle for climate justice, not only in defense of their land and water, protecting their territories and culture from the colonial expansion that has been going on since 1492, but also to strengthen the broader environmental movement. They have called for the working class and all progressives to fight beside them. This is the way we will all win, through mass movements from below, building unity among oppressed and exploited people with clear demands that we can organize around. Challenge the fossil fuel companies. No expansion of the tar sands. Stop the pipelines. Respect Indigenous sovereignty. We have to have a different relationship to the natural world and create a society that benefits the Indigenous and working people in all our diversity. And they are not the only people who are facing this systemic racism, as Rohit was pointing out. Black people have risen up across North America. Earlier this year, the COVID-19 virus spread, exacerbating the economic crisis, as was outlined in an earlier session, throwing millions out of work, and exposing frontline essential workers to serious illness and death, and making it so clear The glaring reality that is Black and otherwise racialized people, primarily women, were bearing the brunt of the pandemic. In the midst of all this, George Floyd was murdered by police in Minneapolis. Another name added to the long list that includes Trayvon Martin, Fred Gray, Breonna Taylor, in Canada, Albert Johnson, Andrew Loku, Regis Korchinski-Paquette, and so many more. This was really nothing new. But in response, there were uprisings across the globe, centered in the United States, but with large demonstrations across Canada and so many other nations. There was barely a town or city that didn't have people marching. Multiracial demonstrations of hundreds of thousands took to the streets. It was the largest sustained demonstrations in the United States history, taking on the systemic racism of the police and the entire political system. It mobilized people who had never been in the streets before, calling for the defunding and abolishment of police departments as we know, calling for funding to put into the basic safe social services that are so necessary in our society. Things change when they cannot stay the same. We live in a society where racism is systemic and manifests itself daily in every institution, from the police, to the schools, to the healthcare system. The numbers of Black people killed by the police in the United States and Canada make this clear. The carding, the levels of incarceration, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And as I said earlier, we live under a capitalist system which was driven by the quest for profit. And who benefits? The 1% who've lived by the motto, divide and rule. Historically, Africans were enslaved to provide labor for the plantations of the Americas, and a racist ideology developed as was outlined. When they won their freedom, and we know they won their freedom by self-activity in the revolts in Haiti, in Jamaica, in Guadeloupe, the southern United States, the capitalists just changed their tactics. In the Caribbean, they brought in indentured service from Asia when the Black people would no longer work the plantations. All in the name of profits, and of course the system continues today, changing when it needs to continue the process of accumulation. There is profound racism embedded in the capitalist system. There are strong links between Indigenous and Black struggles for liberation. I just saw looking on the news today that a new organization has sprung up in Alberta, Black and Indigenous Peoples United to Fight. And you need only to look back at the 60s and the 70s with the rise of the Black Panthers, the American Indian movement, along with other revolutionary socialist groups such as the Young Lords, the Iwakun. They came together to fight back. And the League of Revolutionary Black Workers started speaking about the need and the key role, the need for a working class vanguard, a multiracial working class vanguard. They saw it led by Black workers in the auto industry, and they put forward the role and the critical role as they saw it of the working class in the struggle for change. Fred Hampton, a 21-year-old Panther leader, he was working in Chicago, and he was building what he called a rainbow coalition of Indigenous, Black, Hispanic, and white revolutionary organizations to overthrow the capitalist system, because he believed that it was the only way to end racism and the exploitation of all working people. That's why he was murdered by the police, who were afraid of a Black messiah, as J. Edgar Hoover, then head of the FBI in the US, said, that could potentially lead a revolution, a multiracial revolution of working class peoples across the country. Today, it was the murder of George Floyd that was the spark that ignited the incredible rage bubbling under the surface and brought millions into the streets. And as has been said, it was not the Black community alone. The multiracial nature of the demonstrations was striking, and people were willing to disobey curfews, stand up against riot police, rubber bullets, flash bombs. It gave rise to these calls for the defunding and abolishment of police. It was so strong and so real and so concrete to people who live under this tyranny every day. And even the National Basketball Association, other sports organizations played their role, going on wildcat strikes, withdrawing their labor, taking up the mantle of Muhammad Ali, refusing to go to Vietnam, John Carlos raising a fist in the Olympics, standing on the side of change and with people in struggle. But we also see the pull of reformism and the Democratic Party. Obama meeting with the Black players, telling them to play the games, go back to the courts, instead of continuing their strikes that had the eyes of the world upon it. He said they should stand down and urge people to vote instead, voting in the presidential election as the way forward to end racism and abuse. We saw earlier Biden beating Bernie Sanders and firmly entrenching the control of the Democratic National Committee of the Democratic Party, beating back a progressive challenge calling for Medicare for all, $15 minimum wage, a Green New Deal, and other progressive demands. Electoralism is being touted as the way to win justice and equity. And not that we don't sympathize with all those who want to get rid of Trump. We don't demarcate from them, but there has to be fundamental change, and that has to come from movements from below. Black Lives Matter is a militant anti-racist movement that has emerged across the globe. And as part of it, we are seeing the Movement for Black Lives, a coalition of organizations in the United States which called a strike for Black lives, workers walking off the job. They took up the mantle of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers decades before. It took place in 160 different cities in the US. It's made of SEIU locals, local activists, Service Employees International Union, who has organized some of the lowest paid workers, mostly of color, mostly women in the United States. Teamsters, the United Farm Workers, organized within the huge farms out in the West Coast, primarily of the United States. The Fight for 15 and Union and other community organizations and individuals. And just to give you a taste of it, 1,500 janitors walked out off the job for a $15 minimum wage in a major city in California. 1,400 grocery workers walked out in Brooklyn. Great workers in the Yakima Valley in Washington State. 5 long-term care homes in Detroit shut down. Many walked out for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, exactly how long it took for George Floyd to die. Others for much longer. As one organizer said, a strike for Black lives is using our power as workers to bring attention to racist police violence and many other ways that racism kills us. When workers unite against oppression, strike against oppression, it also gives confidence in the ongoing fight for better wages and conditions, and shows the power of the working class as the agent for change, because it can cripple the capitalist system by withdrawing labor and shutting it down. They also call for guaranteed sick pay, affordable health care, better workplace conditions, better health and safety protections. And as another organizer said, corporate power is a threat to racial justice. This was hugely important, has obviously many lessons for the ongoing struggle. We must challenge racism wherever it occurs, including with our fellow workers, because we are also seeing the rise of right-wing organizations, and they are drawing people. And Rohit said it clearly, we can't simply confront them, we also confront the sewer that breeds them. We see people out of work, losing their homes, losing their families, no leadership from the mainstream parties at all, and seeing nothing in front of them. And scapegoating is in high gear, dividing one against another. Nooses being left in a building site in Toronto, 6, 7, 8 building sites. By actually now we're finding organized groups of racist neo-Nazis intending to harass and intimidate Black workers. Muslims being attacked and killed. There was a Muslim man in his 50s who was a greeter at a mosque in Mississauga. A neo-Nazi came up to him and slashed his throat and killed him. The racism shown to the Mi'kmaq lobster fishers. It's absurd. 350 lobster pots, and they think they're going to deplete the lobster supply off the east coast of Nova Scotia. It's a joke. It's racism that is driving them. It's not economic necessity, and it's not conservation of the lobster supplies. And of course, the Proud Boys being given encouragement by Trump. We have to directly take this on by mobilizing mass protests whenever they appear, but we also have to fight the conditions that breed this. We also have to provide an alternative. More and more people are rejecting capitalism and seeing socialism as a way to the future. But there are too few organized socialists, and that's why it's so important that we work in united fronts with others who want to fight. Our comrades in the East End of Toronto had a real success, which gives a model of how we can unite against racism. When Mark Austin, a Black steelworker, and his partner were attacked by white racists in a park over in the East End of Toronto, he came to a fellow steelworker and a member of the International Socialists. We have a number of steelworkers, members from the IS in that union. And we spoke with others. We got together with the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, the Black Action Defense Committee, the Bangladeshi community, the local mosque, and called a rally at 55 Division, the police division over there, demanding that charges be laid and that park be made safe for the many, many diverse families that use it on the weekends to play with their kids, have picnics with their families and relatives. And because of that demonstration, those charges were laid. We took names, developed a coalition, because our branch was rooted in the community, had already initiated an anti-hate group, and is continuing to work with community members against racism. They're part of organizing a rally at the building site where the most recent news was found. Organizing and building unity against oppression, whether it is defunding police, a local action around the nooses, mobilizing with land defenders, mobilizing in support of international students, status for all, Indigenous sovereignty, against pipelines. This is the way forward. It is possible, as Rohit said, to have a world without racism, but not while capitalism stays in place. That is why we have to build a revolutionary socialist current in the movements that are fighting back, which can inspire people, which can give hope, and allow people to feel that change is possible. And that by building movements from below, with the broad participation and leadership of Indigenous, Black, and people of color that encourages the self-emancipation of the working class in all its diversity, we can be part of creating a new world where exploitation and oppression are things of the past. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Carolyn. So we have a good chunk of time here to do discussion. And as I say, I had a couple of people who are already on the speakers list, one of whom had put up their hand right at the end of the last meeting, and we'll then go first. So we're going to go ahead with Nadine first, and then Sarah. Nadine, go ahead. I think you're muted.
I am indeed muted. I had just gone to get a drink, my fault.
No worries.
Really inspiring talks, really inspiring talks, and thank you. Just at the end, I do have a question about something that sort of hasn't been brought up so far, so if there's time, I would like to. One of the things I wanted to speak to, which I think Chantal already really covered in a powerful way, is the need to create new narratives, and which the socialists can do that challenge it. I think there was a phrase, I think it was AOC that said it in the States, that you can't, unless you can imagine it, you can't fight for it. You won't fight for it. And so I think it's really important to challenge those narratives, both in our writing and discussions with people. I was thinking back on history and the history books I learned, and it was always about the white colonial savior, always. And so it's important for us, I think, to shift those narratives in whatever we create. There was a film that came out, I think a year and a half ago in the States, called A Message from the Future with AOC, and it was short, but it had 12 million hits. And they just came out with the part 2 of that. And in that, they talked about a new society being born in the fires of the fights on the streets. And I thought, oh my God, I never thought I would see that, being a mainstream media sort of a thing. So I think a part of our work is making those struggles visible, participating in them, but helping to change the narrative.
Thank you, Nadine. So the next speaker is Sarah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
My machines are not happy today. Okay, first I want to thank both all of you, but particularly the two speakers, for some very thought-inspiring discussions. However, I'd like to bring it back to something that I think most of us within the broader defined left have tended to ignore, and that's some of the issues around slavery itself. Marx talks about slavery as sort of the primitive wealth accumulation as an aberration, also talks about cotton as the engines of the Industrial Revolution, and at different points talks about forms of labor, unpaid, paid, whatever. What I've seen as I've been thinking about this lately, more because of what's been going on lately, is that what we don't see and what we don't focus on is the role of slavery in mass accumulation, in the accumulation of capital. What you do with, it's not just about the stolen labor. You have commodified millions and millions of people, which have increased the wealth of the people owning these new commodities. We know from work that's beginning to be done mostly in the United States about the role of slaves as collateral for credit. But if you look at the even broader picture, we now understand that you can't understand for example, the Gilded Age, without understanding the massive influx of capital that results as a result of capital, also not just from the trade, but also from the ownership of people, from their commodification, from the fact that it produces wealth and credit and all of the above. I mean, if you look at Marx, when his discussions on credit, if he hadn't taken linen, if he'd taken cotton, which was a much more common, you'd have traced it back in many different ways. But even that discussion doesn't discuss the commodification of people. Now, if we rethink that and we understand the massive effect of the commodification of slaves, then our understanding about the role both of racism and slavery in the emergence of the Industrial Revolution and of mass capitalism changes. And we focus and give honor more to the massive effect of slavery. Now, if we do that, then we begin to understand struggles differently. Because we understand that what we're seeing now is an echo of a process that is at the heart of mass capitalism, of the mass expansion of capitalism, let alone imperialism. So I'm leaving that to the side because I am thinking about it, and I think we need to pay more attention to the role of slavery in accumulation itself because of the issues of the commodification of people. All of a sudden it's like having, what is it? At one point they have, you're counting Brazil, the United States, and the colonies, you have over 30 million slaves, all of which have a value, all of which credit can be taken against. Now, the next question, which I think we should need to recognize, and that's simply, it's part of today's struggle, which I think you've all covered really, really well. But that one of the things we should give honor to is that because of the intensity and the ingrained nature of racism and violence and the way they are coordinated on communities of color, it seems to me that there is a great deal more common self-identity and experience of a common life within communities of color than there is today within the communities of the working class. People will see first and foremost their experience as people of color, and secondary their experience as workers because it is more to the forefront of their lives. And I think we need to give honors to the communities with which struggling people come from and understand that part of what those of us who are white people need to understand that it is a different experience of community, and we need to think to where that takes us. Anyway, thank you.
Thanks very much there, Sarah. I have at this moment an open speakers list. If anybody wants to chime into the discussion, please put up your hand. Or you can put it into the chat window if you prefer. Okay, so Chris had his hand up at one point there. I'm not sure if Chris appears to have disappeared. Michelle, go ahead.
Sorry, thanks. There's just so much that has been thrown up in this discussion. That's fantastic presentations. Thanks to both the speakers. I guess one of the things that I think is on a lot of people's minds because the violence and racism of the system in a crisis like this is just accelerated and intensified, which doesn't mean that the experience of racism somehow in a different era is not as bad, but it's so naked in so many ways. And I think about Joyce Echequan, and just, I mean, it's even hard to talk about. It's so upsetting, but people know that she died in the hospital. As she was dying, she videotaped her pleas for help, that the nursing staff had apparently injected her with morphine when this essentially was a lethal intervention. And I think seeing that, it's very difficult, I think, for people to imagine a society without racism. Knowing that is the experience of so many Indigenous people, not just in Quebec, right across the country, in dealing with the medical system, in dealing with the courts, in dealing with child welfare, in dealing with housing, in dealing with the right to your land and to not be arrested unjustly. But one of the things that struck me throughout this whole discussion is a quote from Marx about why we need a revolution. Actually, there's two things. One is a quote from Nick Estes, who wrote a fantastic book on Our History is the Future, about Indigenous struggles, including recently the struggle around Standing Rock, which he participated in, where he said it's easier in this neoliberal era to imagine the end of the world than to imagine a future without capitalism and racism. And that's what makes me think about the quote from Marx. He said, we need a revolution, not only because this system that we live in, only through a revolution can you overthrow it, but because in doing a revolution, in making a revolution, in challenging the system, in trying to fight for a better world, the working class makes itself fit to found society anew. And I think it encapsulates why it's important that it's not sufficient to talk about education or talk about the types of measures that we often hear about when we're talking about tackling racism. It's struggle that changes people. And I think that's very hopeful, because a heck of a lot of people are being, whether they want to or not, are having to struggle. And I think that's something that as Marxists we can look to, is to say, in those struggles, how are those struggles shaped? What are the ideas informing those struggles? What are the tools people have in those struggles? What history can they draw on? What examples can inspire? And as Nadine was talking about, what are the narratives that we have? And I think we don't have to just imagine a future. We can look to past struggles that have shown us the potential for ordinary people to overthrow the system, for ordinary people to take control of the future, for ordinary people to take control of things like science and culture and art. So never mind things like food and housing and clothing and our interrelationships and our relationship with nature. So I think that's important for us to talk about, is that is how people transform themselves. It isn't struggle, and it's not a straight line. It's a struggle. And it's going to mean, and in struggle we will change ourselves, and we will change the world.
Thanks very much, Michelle. The next speaker we have is Eric. There we go.
Hi, I'm calling in from New York, and we've been involved in, when this thing started, there would be multiple demonstrations going on every day, and we were just jumping on them. Really, the Black Lives Matter just transformed the thing. And I mean, if you look back to when people were thinking, there was a quite some time ago when people thought that sort of the Tea Party was the thing that was happening on the ground, and then Occupy came and just showed that our side was so much bigger than we swept them away. This is so much bigger than that. The same thing happened. People were on the street, people were off the streets for a while because of COVID, and you saw some of the reopening protests, and then Black Lives Matter brought everybody back, brought all of us back out again, masked but out on the streets, and it's been continuing for so long. And multiracial and a vast amount of support. I mean, in cities after cities, it's been led by young Black people, but it's gotten much more support than any of these kind of protests against racist police violence have in the past. I mean, this has been a gradual thing that has been reaching out, but it's really is at new levels now. So you had very right at the beginning of it, 54% of Americans thinking that burning down the Minneapolis police station was justified, and larger percentages supporting Black Lives Matter in general. In New York, it took us 5 years of demonstrations after Eric Gardner was killed just to get the cop who killed him fired, and he was never indicted. But here, the cops were indicted. There's cities around the country who are talking about defunding the police, that banning chokeholds, all that other stuff that you would have spent years in legal maneuvers to try to do, and it would have never gone anywhere. But that's not enough. And the thing is that the movement knows that's not enough. The movement is asking for much more than that. So you hear people talking about abolishing the police. Now we know that it's a capitalist society. They're going to need some kind of policing function. They can do some kind of reforms. Abolishing the police is not one of them. But I think people know that, and that this is the push about this is not just about policing. It comes in the context of the economic crisis. The unemployment, the COVID, the rest of it, half of Black adults not working, but a crisis that's hitting the working class in general. And the legitimacy of the system, of our system, is so much less than it was when people could turn movements like this into reforms. People know that there's something much bigger that needs to be changed. At the same time, those demonstrations can't keep on going. There needs to be some kind of organization that comes out of it, and that's the thing that people are working with now. That's not that hasn't quite happened to the extent it should. But you do have just so many people supporting it and out there and knowing that there's much bigger changes that need to happen. Trump, of course, everybody's trying to divide the movement. The liberals are trying to divide the good protesters from the bad protesters. The Democratic governors are trying to say, oh, Trump's National Guard is terrible, but defending their own police who are using tear gas. And people are seeing through it. Trump is trying to divide people by, talk about Antifa and the chaos in the cities and all the rest of that. But for his own personal gain right now, trying to use it in the election. And that's calling for the National Guard to be called out. He called out the National Guard in DC, and there was such a reaction against that. You had veteran support organizations and those kind of things receiving mass amount of calls from the military and the National Guard from people inside them saying, I don't want to go out if they call me in New York City, if they call me into cities. What can I do? In Portland, where we used those federal troops, trying to say the police weren't doing enough. They didn't have the power to do much to stop anything, and it increased the demonstrations. It brought the demonstrations back up to another level again when he did that. The danger, though, is that they're now turning to the extra parliamentary, armed bodies of men, to the far right. And that's another thing the Black Lives Matter has to do, is unite with other people in taking on, not in dropping their fight against the police and state, but also in special united fronts against the far right. But I think that the opposition to that is there. We can do that. I think that the key is that this is in a situation where the whole belief in some kind of form of the state fixing this kind of thing isn't there anymore, and what's needed now is organization to take that forward.
Thanks very much. I have a couple of speakers now. Alan, Alan. Go ahead.
Hi, I hope people can hear me. I just wanted to follow on from Sarah's contribution. I think she's absolutely correct in saying that it's absolutely crucial for socialists from, you know, Western European backgrounds or European backgrounds to be incredibly sensitive to the lived experience of non-whites. You know, we're talking about in North America, but, you know, in North America and in, you know, for revolutionaries in Europe. And that means supporting their right, if they want to organize separately in black only or people of color only, or, you know, whatever the self-identity of that particular group of revolutionaries is. But, you know, I don't think we should insist that they have to. You know, I think our tradition in IST is to create multiracial organizations, and, you know, that's the path that we're traveling. But we absolutely understand if you know, if there's people, black, brown, Muslim, socialists, that feel that they want to organize separately, we've got to respect that and work with them. Where I would kind of like, I'm not sure exactly how far Sarah was going in the direction in terms of the description of the emergence of capitalism and the driving force of capitalism. I'm in Florida, and one of the, you know, bases of the Uhuru movement, the African People's Socialist Party, is in Florida in St. Pete. And their analysis of capitalism is essentially that capitalism, the heart of capitalism, is really a continental struggle between a white continent, being Europe, and North America being a settler extension of Europe, and Africa. Now, that dynamic played a significant part in the growth of capitalism, and there's still, you know, an incredible imbalance in terms of power in capitalism. But taking that, the logic of their position and the, you know, the actual messaging that comes out from that. For example, we shared a platform over a racial justice thing in 2012, and that I argued that, you know, in the 80s it was the South African masses who inspired us, and right now it's the Egyptian and Greek masses that inspire us. But within a week or within a month, there was an article that then was put into one of their books about the Greek struggles, essentially saying there's no way we can support the Greek struggles because it's simply a case of privileged, you know, one section of privileged white people fighting over the spoils of stolen wealth. And, you know, I think we have to stick to the, you know, a rigorous understanding of capitalism that sees its, you know, its potential to create horrors, you know, outside of the individual factories, and, you know, that it is covered in blood back then and now, but not go to the extent of like having a model of the system that is essentially a racial model. I mean, that model that I said the African People's Socialist Party has, you know, includes countries that didn't have any colonial past, like, you know, Hungary, Greece, Romania. You know, these it's you know, it's not an analysis that really is very helpful for the struggle. I'll just leave it there.
Thanks very much, comrade. And so just looking at the timing here, I'm going to do a last speaker here, and then we'll give the speakers an opportunity to wrap up so that we'll be able to have a little bit of break time between now and the next session. And so John Bell, you're next.
Yeah, hi, I'll try and be brief. The thing that for me connects the first session that we talked about, COVID and the crisis, and this session with around the fight against racism, is how the far right has grabbed a hold of the COVID crisis to organize in a way that really surprises me. And we've seen disturbingly successful demonstrations like the one that was in Toronto yesterday, with hundreds of people marching through the streets unchallenged, behind the banners of freedom and pretend that distorted, peculiar view of freedom and liberation. But scratch the surface, and we're looking at people who are peddling the most destructive and disturbing theories of conspiracy and science denial and what have you. But the far right has used these things to organize in a way that they tried to use other aspects of crisis in the past, and were largely unsuccessful because they were much more easily exposed. And so we have to be, we have to be aware of and start to arm ourselves to fight back against that form of organization. And the one other thing I want to point out is that here in Canada, any shred of it can't happen here, oh, look down at the US, things are so much worse there. Any shred of that has to be just wiped away by events like those taking place around Caledonia and the land back struggle there, that what's going on in the Mi'kmaq lobster fishery, but also in the incident in Red Deer, Alberta, just a couple of weeks ago, where a tiny handful, and there was literally a handful of local anti-racists, wanted to have a little demonstration in Red Deer, Alberta, that was pro Black Lives Matter and pro Indigenous rights, and based under the basic broad "We're Against Racism" banner. And it was invaded by an organized gang of far-right patriots, essentially a fascist militia, who assaulted and basically, drove them away in broad sight of the RCMP, that they were literally standing by and doing nothing. And if all of this was photographed and chronicled by a TV reporter who had the nerve to basically interview the RCMP officer in charge and challenge him and say, well, why didn't you lay charges? His response was, if you didn't see it, his response was literally to say, well, you're assuming that one group's voice is more important than the other. He's essentially parroting that infamous quote from Donald Trump around Charlottesville, where Trump said, there are good people on both sides, when on one side you had Nazis, and on the other side you had anti-racists. And we have to be absolutely clear. There was happily a bit of a shitstorm in Alberta, aimed at the police and at the Jason Kenney government, the conservative government there, but not nearly enough. And the whole thing seems to have been swept away and almost forgotten. We can't forget those things. We can't fall prey to the circus in the States. That's there. Things are so much better here. We can't allow that sentiment an inch of purchase here in our struggles.
Thanks, John. So we've got a few minutes left for the speakers. If there's anything that you want to come back on, anything you want to wrap up on. So first of all, we'll go with Rohit. Is there anything you want to come back on there?
I'll just thank everyone for the very insightful comments, and just kind of end by saying that the legitimacy of the system is in crisis. The ruling class is entirely shaken and fragmented. The U.S. democratic system is clearly churned up to absolute despicables as the only options in front of people, and especially after the failure of the popular Sanders campaign, there is a class anger that has lost faith in the system. And as Eric was mentioning, this is the time for revolutionary organizations to come out of it all and to build the party. And I think we will hear from the speakers in the next session more about that. And also just to touch about kind of two things that Carolyn raised, which I think are really important. First is to be aware of the pull of reformism that we must constantly remain cautious and vigilant about. We should be aware from history that under the heat from below, the ruling class will try everything to relieve the pressure. They will either unleash the state apparatus to crush the movement if that is possible, and in cases like today when it is not possible without resulting in a civil war, they will give partial concessions and try to fragment the movement and divide the ranks. And the partial concessions to demands such as defund the police or the multiple police reform bills and so on. So it is our responsibility as socialists to side with the most radical and the most revolutionary of demands within the movement and organize ourselves around that. And finally, also like how the fight against Islamophobic racism and anti-migrant racism is tied to our broader anti-racist struggles. And as John said, far-right groups are trying to organize on these grounds. The neo-Nazi murder of the Muslim man recently shows the impunity that is growing, and the crisis of capitalism will continue to fester the growth and lay the grounds for their growth. And this is also something for us to be very conscious and to remain and to be active about as we go forward.
Very good. Thanks, Comrade. Carolyn, is there anything to wrap up?
Yeah, just a few words. I mean, I agree very, very much with what Rohit just put forward. And I think that we are, as he said, in a very critical moment. We're in crisis right now, and people tend to see the horror of it all, of COVID, of the economic crisis, of people out of work, all the rise of racism, all of the police attacks, all of that. But at the same time, we balance that with the huge risings from below that have been accompanying this. And, you know, the old words, they are few and we are many. It's very, very true. And it's a question of how we organize ourselves. And I think that's the critical thing. And I think that we're going to see tremendous opportunities right now. And always, as they say, keep your eye on the prize. We have a situation right now, and we have the ability to organize ourselves. And I know I was at a Six Nation Haudenosaunee demonstration a few weeks ago with a number of other comrades from Toronto and many, many other people. And I just want to show, I was asked to speak at that rally, and this is the, if people can see it, this was given to me by one of the Haudenosaunee land defenders, and it's pretty clear, you know, united we stand, divided we fall. They are leading that struggle. It is their struggle, and we, you know, and we are there to support their struggle. And as you can see, white, yellow, red, brown, and black. That's what the unity is, and we have to be there when these struggles are there, and make them as strong as possible. And I think also when I was talking earlier about the ability to seize on issues that come up wherever we may be. There are the huge rallies, and we take part in them. We have to take part of them and make them larger and stronger and more militant, and bring an analysis that we see as very hopeful for the possibility of change. But I think, like in our own union, you know, after that, around Mark Arston when he was attacked by police, this was on the page of the United Steelworkers National magazine. And inside, this is, people can see it, it was said, but here you can see in our area council in Toronto, you see the people there who are marching, and those people are on the executive that I sit on in Toronto. This is the leadership, the rising leadership in our unions, and I think that's what gives such hope to the future. People are there, they face oppression, they face exploitation, and they're marching, leading a march, but behind them are steelworkers of every background, every race, every color. And I think that's the type of movement we have to build today, and build that revolutionary current, so that we are in a situation where we can make a huge difference and really put the capitalists, the racists, to put them on the spot in incredible ways. And anyone who shares that vision, you know, by the end of this meeting today, we ask you if you'd like to join the International Socialist and fight with us toward the goal we're trying to achieve. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Carolyn. So similar to what we did in between the previous sessions, it is now 3:32. And the third session on why we need a revolutionary organization is going to be coming up at exactly 3:40, which means